China and Russia are erasing their border, and the speed at which they are doing it should stop you cold. In 2022 alone, 2 permanent crossings opened between the two countries, the very first ones in the entire history of the two nations. These are countries that share 2,600 miles of frontier, roughly the width of the continental United States, and they had 0 permanent crossings for most of the last century. You heard that right, and that is just the beginning. If you want to understand how this changes everything, hit a quick like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how a militarized Cold War frontier became the most consequential construction zone on Earth. Here is where the story starts, on a frozen river in 1969, where soldiers from both sides were shooting at each other across the same water they are now bridging. To understand what is happening on that border today, you have to understand what it was before. Picture a frontier so militarized that soldiers on both sides had standing orders to shoot first. Not a metaphor, not Cold War posturing. Actual pitched battles on actual ice with actual casualties. In 1969, Russian and Chinese troops fought each other on the frozen Amur River over a disputed island called Zhenbao. It was not a skirmish. It was a full military engagement. Tanks, casualties. The real possibility that 2 nuclear powers were about to go to war with each other, not with the West, but with each other. After that, the border did not soften, it hardened. For the next 5 decades, 4,200 kilometers of shared frontier was defined by barbed wire, armed patrols, and near-total economic isolation. That is longer than the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, from Maine to Miami, and back again. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. During those 50 years, no permanent crossing was ever built. Not one bridge, not one tunnel. 2 of the largest nations on Earth, sharing the longest militarized border outside of the Korean Peninsula, and you could not drive across it. You could not take a train across it. The river was the wall. That is the world that existed as recently as 2021. Now here's the part that most people never stop to think about. The shift did not happen gradually. There was no slow thaw. There was no decade of diplomacy that eased things incrementally. What happened instead was a sudden, structural, almost violent reversal, compressed into a window of 3 years so short that most of the world has not yet registered it happened. 2 permanent crossings were built. A third was announced. Tunnels were demolished and replaced. Pipelines were laid. Terminals were approved, all of it simultaneously, all of it on a border that within living memory had soldiers pointing rifles at each other across the ice. That is not a trade relationship warming up. That is something else entirely. But the frozen river and the history of what happened on it is only the frame. What they are building across it right now, starting with a single railway bridge, is where this story gets hard to believe. The first thing they built was a railway bridge. That sounds simple. It is not simple. Russia and China have shared that border since the 17th century. In all that time, through the czars, through the Soviet Union, through the Cold War, through the collapse and the rebuild, nobody had ever put a railway bridge across the Amur River, not once. The Tongjiang Railway Bridge opened in 2022. It is just under 2 miles long, and from the moment the first train crossed it, it changed the arithmetic of moving goods between the two countries permanently. Here is what that means in real numbers. The bridge handles 20 million tons of cargo every year. 20 million tons. That is roughly the weight of every car currently registered in the state of California, moving across a single river, crossing every 12 months. And it does not just move more, it moves faster. The bridge cuts transport distances by 900 miles compared to the routes that existed before. Think about what that means for a freight operator. Every train that crosses that bridge, instead of taking the old route, saves nearly 1,000 miles of track. That is not an efficiency gain. That is a restructuring of the entire supply chain. Now here is the forced reframe, because the bridge alone is not the story. The moment that crossing opened, it did not stay a bridge. It became an anchor. Within months, developers began building a grain terminal on the Russian bank directly connected to the crossing, then an oil terminal, then plans for a gas terminal at the same site. One bridge became the spine of a full-spectrum commodity hub, handling grain, oil, gas, and bulk cargo from a single riverbank. Think of it like a power strip. The bridge is the wall socket. Everything else, the grain terminal, the oil pipes, the gas infrastructure, just plugs in. You build the connection once, then you load it with everything you want to move. Here is what most people get wrong about infrastructure like this. They see a bridge and they think convenience, a slightly shorter route, a modest improvement. What they are not seeing is that a crossing of this scale, with this much commodity infrastructure attached to it, does not just move trade, it redirects it permanently. The supply chains that orient themselves around a crossing like this do not reroute back when political winds shift. The terminals get built, the contracts get signed, the trains start running on schedules, and then the crossing becomes load-bearing for both economies. That is what happened at Tongjiang. In 3 years, it went from a proposal to a railway bridge to a multi-commodity hub handling some of the most strategically important resources on Earth. Iron ore, soybeans, crude oil, all of it funneled through a single point that did not exist before 2022. And this was just the first crossing, because while engineers were still finishing the railway bridge in the east, a completely different team was building something 400 miles to the west. A crossing that would do something the railway bridge could not do. It would let people through. For decades, the cities of Blagoveshchensk and Haihe stared at each other across the Amur River. On a clear day, you could stand on the Russian bank and read the signs on the Chinese side. The cities are less than a mile apart at their closest point. Less than a mile. That is shorter than many morning commutes. And for most of the last century, it might as well have been an ocean. There was no bridge. There was no tunnel. If you needed to cross, you took a hovercraft in summer and a truck convoy across the frozen river in winter, weather permitting, schedule permitting, politics permitting. Two cities, close enough to see each other's windows, functionally unreachable. The Blagoveshchensk-Haihe Highway Bridge changed that. It opened in 2022, the same year as the railway bridge, and it was the first permanent road crossing ever built between Russia and China. The first one in the entire history of two nations that have shared a border for 4 centuries. In 2024, it was handling 200 trucks every single day. 200 trucks. That is a fully loaded freight convoy arriving and departing every 7 minutes, around the clock, without stopping. The goods moving across that bridge in a single week would fill a warehouse the size of 10 city blocks. Then January 2nd, 2025 arrived, and the bridge opened to passenger vehicles. Now here is the part that changes the nature of this story entirely. By July 2025, 6 months after passenger vehicles were allowed to cross, the bridge had logged 170,000 vehicle crossings. 170,000 in 6 months. That is not trade traffic. That is not freight. That is people, workers, families, business owners, tourists, moving between two countries that spent 50 years making that movement almost impossible. Here is what that number actually means at street level. 170,000 crossings in 6 months works out to roughly 940 crossings every single day. That is a small town's worth of people moving across a border that used to require a hovercraft and a prayer. And this is where the forced reframe matters, because the bridge is not just a convenience upgrade for people who used to take the hovercraft. It is doing something structurally different. It is turning 2 separate cities into one economic zone. Restaurants, retail, logistics, labor, all of it is beginning to orient across the river rather than away from it. Blagoveshchensk and Haihe are not 2 cities with a bridge between them. They are becoming one city with a river running through the middle. That process, once it starts, does not reverse. You cannot undo the supply chains. You cannot undo the leases. You cannot undo the hiring of the workers who now commute across the Amur every morning. The bridge made the connection. The connection is now making the economy, and that economy is the glue. But here is the brutal catch that nobody in the West is talking about. 2 bridges, one for freight, one for people, would already be a transformation. What makes this a system rather than 2 data points is the 3rd crossing, announced in October 2025, a 3rd bridge over the same river within a 3-year window. And the reason that 3rd crossing matters is not about capacity. It is about something far more strategic than capacity. Because when you build redundancy into a corridor, you stop it from being a corridor. You turn it into an artery. And arteries, unlike corridors, are very hard to shut down. But before we get to what redundancy means strategically, there is a bottleneck that nearly strangled all of this before it could grow. A tunnel built in 1900 that nobody thought to replace for over a century, until someone decided to tear it out and rebuild it in 12 months. There is a rule in logistics that most people never think about. A supply chain is only as fast as its slowest point. It does not matter how modern your bridges are. It does not matter how many trucks are crossing. If somewhere in the middle of your corridor there is a choke point, a single narrow passage that everything must squeeze through, that choke point sets the speed limit for the entire system. For over a century, the Eastern Rail Corridor between Russia and China had exactly that problem, and the choke point had a name: the Sui-Fenei Railway Tunnel. It was built in 1900. Read that again slowly. 1900, the year before Queen Victoria died, the year the first petrol-powered tractor was invented. The tunnel was already old when the First World War started. It was already ancient when the Soviet Union collapsed. And until very recently, freight trains between Russia and China were still squeezing through it at speeds that made the whole corridor groan. Here is what that meant in practice. The tunnel was a single-bore passage, narrow by modern standards, with gradients and curves engineered for locomotives that no longer exist. Every train that passed through it had to slow down, not slightly, dramatically. It was the railroad equivalent of a 6-lane highway suddenly narrowing to 1 lane for half a mile. Everything stacked up behind it. Every shipment, every schedule, every delivery window, all of it held hostage by infrastructure that was older than commercial aviation. Now, here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. Nobody replaced it for 125 years. Not because it was impossible, not because there was no money, but because for most of that century, the traffic through that corridor was light enough that the tunnel's limitations did not matter enough to fix. The border was militarized, trade was minimal. A slow tunnel through a quiet corridor was an inconvenience, not a crisis. Then the bridges opened. The freight volume surged, and suddenly, a tunnel built for 19th century train speeds was sitting in the middle of a 21st century supply corridor like a cork in a bottle, so they pulled the cork. In 12 months, engineers demolished the original tunnel and bored a modern 602-meter replacement. 602 meters. That is roughly 6.5 American football fields, end to end, carved through solid ground, in 1 year. The new tunnel doubled train speeds through the corridor to 120 kilometers per hour. That is 75 miles per hour. For context, that is faster than most American freight trains travel on open track. And this is the forced reframe, because the tunnel replacement is not just a speed upgrade, it is the removal of a ceiling. The bridges could be built, the terminals could be approved, the contracts could be signed. But until that tunnel was gone, the entire eastern corridor had a hard limit on how much it could grow. The new bore did not just make trains faster, it unlocked the capacity that the bridges had already created but could not yet use. One tunnel, built in 1900, replaced in 12 months, and with it gone, the Eastern Corridor stopped being a work in progress and started being a functioning system. But here's the thing, as transformative as that is, bridges, road crossings, modernized tunnels, all of it moves things that you can stack on a train or load onto a truck. Grain, coal, manufactured goods. What none of it can move is the resource that Russia has more of than almost anywhere else on Earth, and that China needs more desperately than almost anything else: gas. And the infrastructure being built to move that is on a scale that makes every bridge and tunnel in this story look like a warm-up act. Russia has more natural gas than any country on Earth, not marginally more, dramatically more. Russia sits on roughly 19% of the world's total proven gas reserves. That is almost 1 in every 5 cubic meters of natural gas that exists underground, anywhere on the planet, belonging to a single country. For most of the last half-century, Europe was the customer. Pipelines ran west. Contracts were signed in euros. The entire Russian gas export architecture was built around a single direction, toward the Atlantic, toward Western markets, toward an economic relationship that Moscow treated as permanent. Then, February 2022 arrived, and the direction changed. Here is where the story gets structurally important. When Western sanctions hit after the invasion of Ukraine, Russia did not just lose customers. It lost the infrastructure logic that had defined its energy economy for 50 years. Pipelines that ran west became liabilities overnight. Contracts that had been ironclad became politically toxic, and Russia found itself holding the largest gas reserves on Earth, with nowhere certain to send them. China was already there. Power of Siberia, the first major pipeline running east from Russia into northeast China, had been flowing since 2019. By the time sanctions landed, it was already carrying 30 billion cubic meters of gas every year. 30 billion cubic meters. To put that in terms you can picture, that is enough gas to heat every home in Germany for 2 full years, moving through a single pipeline every year. But 30 billion was not the ceiling. It was the foundation. Steel is already in the ground on the Far Eastern gas pipeline. This is a separate route, running from Sakhalin Island on Russia's Pacific coast directly into northeast China. It is not a proposal. It is not a negotiation. It is under active construction, with first gas flows confirmed for January 2027. When it opens, it adds 12 billion cubic meters of annual capacity on top of what Power of Siberia already carries. Now here is the forced reframe. Because the Far Eastern pipeline is significant, but it is not the number that should be stopping you cold. That number is 50 billion. Power of Siberia 2, a second major pipeline still under negotiation, would carry 50 billion cubic meters of gas every year if it is built. 50 billion. That is larger than the entire annual gas consumption of France, through one pipeline. And here is the detail most people are not tracking. Power of Siberia 2 would not just add capacity, it would route gas that currently flows west through Siberia and redirect it east through Mongolia into China. Gas that Europe used to buy, redirected permanently. Think of the pipeline network like a river system. Right now, Russia's gas flows mostly west, toward Europe, toward the Atlantic. What is being built on the eastern border is a new set of tributaries, carved deliberately, designed to pull that flow in a completely different direction. Once those tributaries are deep enough and wide enough, the river does not go back. Water does not flow uphill. Here is what the combined numbers look like when you add it all together. Power of Siberia already flowing at 30 billion cubic meters. The Far Eastern pipeline adding 12 billion from 2027. Power of Siberia 2 potentially adding 50 billion on top of that. You are looking at a combined pipeline gas capacity of over 90 billion cubic meters flowing from Russia into China every single year. 90 billion. That is more gas than the entire European Union imported from Russia at the peak of their dependence, now flowing east instead of west. And every cubic meter of it moves without touching a Western financial institution, without crossing a Western monitored shipping lane, without exposure to a single sanctions mechanism that the United States or Europe controls. But gas is not the only resource being redirected, because while the pipeline engineers are laying steel east of Siberia, a completely different kind of infrastructure is being finished on the Pacific coast. One designed to move something far more fundamental than energy. It is designed to move food. and the terminal being built to do it is large enough to feed nations. Before a single grain of wheat reaches your table, it travels through a port. That is not a detail. That is the architecture of global food supply. And whoever controls the port controls the flow. For decades, Russia moved most of its grain through two gates, the Black Sea, the Baltic. Both of them run through geography that the West monitors, influences, and in moments of crisis, can pressure. During 2022, Black Sea grain shipments became a geopolitical bargaining chip almost immediately. Everyone understood that the gate could become a lever. What is being built at Zarubino changes that. Zarubino is a port on Russia's Pacific coast, just north of the North Korean border. It has direct rail connections into Russia's grain-producing heartland. It faces the open Pacific, and the terminal approved for construction there will handle 33.5 million tons of grain every year. 33.5 million tons. That is nearly the entire annual wheat output of Canada, one of the largest grain exporters on Earth, moving through a single terminal on a coastline most people cannot find on a map. The ships it loads carry 91,000 tons per journey, heavier than a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, sailing straight into the Pacific without passing through a single choke point where a Western Navy has a presence. Here is what most people get wrong about a project like this. They see a grain terminal, a logistics upgrade. What they are not seeing is that Zarubino is not being built to make Russian exports faster. It is being built to make them unsanctionable. Efficiency is about speed. Unsanctionable is about survival. Now here's the part that puts every bridge, every tunnel, every pipeline, and every grain terminal in this video into a single frame. Take a step back. Look at all of it at once. A railway bridge that did not exist before 2022, now moving 20 million tons of cargo a year. A road bridge turning two cities into one economic zone. A third crossing creating redundancy that makes the corridor impossible to shut down. A century-old tunnel demolished and replaced in 12 months. A gas pipeline already in the ground with first flows confirmed for 2027, adding to the 30 billion cubic meters already moving east every year. And a grain terminal on the Pacific that bypasses every maritime choke point the West has ever used as leverage. 12 megaprojects across 4,200 miles of frontier, built simultaneously in 3 years. On a border that within living memory had soldiers pointing rifles at each other across the ice. Here is the brutal truth that most people are not ready to sit with. This is not a trade relationship being expanded. This is not two countries getting friendlier. What China and Russia are building, project by project, crossing by crossing, terminal by terminal, is a parallel global economic architecture. A second system, physically constructed in the one geography on Earth where no Western Navy can patrol, no Western court can rule, and no Western sanction can reach. Every bridge is engineered to move cargo without touching a Western port. Every pipeline is engineered to move energy without crossing a Western-monitored shipping lane. Every grain terminal is engineered to feed markets without passing through a Western-controlled financial institution. The whole thing is being built to function independently of the system the West built after World War II. And it is being built fast enough that by the time the West finishes deciding what to call it, the infrastructure will already be irreversible. That is what erasing a border actually means. Not friendship, not diplomacy, concrete, steel, pipeline, crane. And the question you have to ask yourself is not whether this changes the world. It already is. The question is whether the world has noticed yet. If this changed how you think about who actually controls global trade, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Is what China and Russia are building a genuine rival to the Western-led global order? Or is it a partnership built on desperation that falls apart the moment their interests diverge? Drop your answer below. I will be reading everyone.